From intake to rehab, our work together. Thanks to the staff of the Massachusetts Rehabilitation Commission for providing the content for this presentation. Because of the depth of services provided by VR, this presentation digs deeper into what happens when a client works with a placement specialist to gain employment. In the following diagram, we've highlighted where interpreters may enter this process and what is valuable for practitioners to think about when asked to interpret in these settings. The dark purple highlights points in the process where interpreting may be needed. Getting in the door is the work done leading to the moment an employer and job seeker meet, the interview. This may include completing an application, calling to schedule an appointment, or stopping by to follow up on an application. While small on this screen, the interview is actually a very complex interaction, which presents challenges for the interpreter, so we'll discuss various types of interviews and interview questions later. Once the person is hired, there are many more interactions that need to be interpreted, as the employer and employee work together to determine how they will best communicate in the long run. Vocational rehabilitation only provides support for new employees for the first 3 months of their employment. Let's examine each part of this process more carefully. You may be in a situation where you are interpreting the placement specialist's first meeting with a client. The specialist may or may not have any experience working with people who are deaf or hard of hearing. They may ask questions of the interpreter about the applicant or about the interpreter, and they might be curious about how the deaf person communicates when an interpreter is not present. One of the key things to remember when working with someone doing placement is that they are often assessing the interaction from the perspective of the employer who is meeting a deaf person and using an interpreter for the first time. So every part of the interaction may be an evaluation. Does the applicant introduce the interpreter? Do they explain how to use an interpreter? Do they look at the placement person as well as the interpreter? Even if the placement person is experienced in serving deaf and hard of hearing people, they often take the role of an ignorant employer. And as interpreters, we need to remember that our responses and behavior is being assessed just as much as the deaf person. For interpreters, being able to interpret that initial meeting between a placement specialist and a deaf job seeker at intake paves the way for how to work more successfully with the job seeker during the job search. You may be able to assess the client's communication skills, familiarity with the hiring process, and be able to review his or her resume at this time. If you have even been on one interview, you know that it is a contrived event with norms of speaking and behaving that are different from other interactions. Being able to request opportunities to become familiar with the deaf person's background and practice interpreting interviews for them is the best way to achieve an effective interpretation in this setting. There are many different people participating in a client's VR process: a counselor, a supervisor, the client, spouse or parent, training facility, placement specialist, employers, and so on. But each of these people may have different goals, interests, and expectations from the VR process. The interpreter's relationship with these different stakeholders may differ depending on their position within the VR system, whether the interpreter is an independent contractor, regular contractor, part-time staff interpreter, or full-time staff interpreter. Let's take a look at some of these stakeholder relationships. On the right side of the slide, we are representing a typical encounter between someone applying for a job and the people they encounter at an employer in the hiring process. On the left, we show the people who may be working with a deaf job seeker preparing to interface with an employer. Note that the interpreter might be working between the job seeker and the placement specialist and or the RCD and the placement specialist. Now notice how this image changes when we connect a deaf job seeker to an employer. The placement specialist may have the strongest link, thus the solid red line with the employer. This placement specialist might seem more concerned about the employer than the applicant, because the relationship with that company may open doors for more than one person they're helping find employment. But the RCD, with their expert knowledge of how deaf people adapt in the workplace, may also be called upon to interface with the employer. And at the workplace, the job seeker is developing connections with all the other parties through an interpreter. How would it feel to develop relationships with coworkers through a third party? Looking at the diagram below, can you think about what information an interpreter might need from each party in order to provide the best services? From the placement specialist, it would be good to know if it is a first or second interview, what the job title is, and if the company knows an interpreter is coming. From the company, it would be good to know what kind of business they're in, and whether the environment is noisy, where it would be difficult to interpret. From the job seeker, it would be good to review their resume and talk about their signs for different business terms. And from the job coach, it would be good to know if they will be in the interview or will be coaching on how to answer questions during the interview. And from the RCD, it would be nice to get an appreciation of the client's language and communication skills. What are some of the things that can happen during the application process that may present challenges for you as an interpreter? Many applications are now online and may be done at a kiosk or computer in an open area. And often applications include personality testing that look at soft skills. These might ask the same questions in different ways. Some companies are now using telephone interviews as a screening process, or as the final interview. Anything done over the phone has an increased level of complexity because the norms in that environment favor people who can hear and don't adapt easily to the timing differences required for interpretation. Think about how you might talk to the deaf person about this problem and how the two of you will manage it. Now the client is in the door and ready for an interview. There are many different kinds of interviews, depending on the industry, the position, etc. Some interviews are conducted by HR as a screening process, and a second interview will be done with people who work in the department. The interview might be conducted by one person or by a team. And interviews might even include group participation to assess the teamwork potential of the job seeker. What questions might you ask to prepare for an interview to learn which of the categories it will fall into? And who would you ask? One of the most difficult decisions a job seeker needs to make, and may make over and over depending on how many interviews they have, is when to let the employer know that they are deaf and will be needing an interpreter. Here are a few reasons that this presents a challenge. It may be the first time an employer has encountered a deaf person. And if an interpreter isn't available, the deaf person may risk losing an interview opportunity. Some deaf people choose to explain that they need an interpreter in order to ask for flexibility in arranging an interpreter. How might disclosure or lack of disclosure prior to an appointment affect the interpreted interview? Interviews have changed over the years, and even with asking questions in advance, you need to be prepared for anything. Some interviews include tours, so be sure to bring your comfortable walking shoes. Some interviews include performing work that may be done, so keep in mind that one part of the evaluation might be how the person communicates with and without interpreters. Sometimes there is specialized vocabulary, where common words might have unusual meanings. For example, the word cookies means something very different if you are applying for a position as a baker or a software analyst. So be sure to meet with the applicant to review their resume and technical vocabulary. Behavioral interviewing with what-if questions or tell-me-about-a-time questions help assess problem-solving skills, ability to work independently, and values. You can help prepare yourself and the interviewee by going to some of these common job search sites that have examples of interview questions. How do you know if a company will be more likely to use behavioral questions or hands-on demonstration? Behavioral questions are complex, giving the employer a better sense of how the applicant will work with other people and respond to supervision. You can research the field, the company, or the position to find out more about this, or realize that larger companies are more likely to use complex hiring processes than small businesses. In general, deaf people do better in their job search when they have the opportunities to prepare, predict, and practice, just as we recommend for you. Placement groups provide one way that job seekers can learn how to present themselves more effectively in an interview. Career centers and college career offices often provide these placement groups at no charge. Mock interviews also help job seekers become more comfortable with what they may encounter in an interview. Advocating for opportunities to work with a deaf person as they prepare will allow you to both do the best interview possible. So when offered a chance to interpret an interview, be sure to meet with the applicant ahead of time to review their resume, discuss how they will introduce you, discuss the seating arrangement, and make agreements about how to ask for clarification. Other hiring activities, such as physical exam, drug test, and paperwork, may also require interpretation. And new employees often participate in orientations, which may be regularly scheduled in a classroom with video or informal one-on-one meetings with HR personnel. As a new employee acclimates to the new job, interpreter use may decline over the first few months, and it's also the time the deaf person first connects with coworkers.